Hello dears. This is the Story Sculpt channel, and you are listening to one of the chapters of the book In Other Rooms, Other Wonders, written by Daniyal Mueenuddin in January 2009. This is chapter 2 of the book, titled Saleema.
Saleema was born in the Julan clan, blackmailers and bootleggers. Muslim refugees at partition from the country northwest of Delhi. They were lucky. The new border lay only 30 or 40 miles distant, and from thieving expeditions they knew how to travel unobserved along canals and tracks skirting the edge of the Kholistan desert, crossing into Pakistan. On the fourth night they came to a Hindu village, abandoned by all but a few old women. They drove them away and occupied the houses, finding pots and pans, buckets, even guard dogs, which grew accustomed to them. During Saleema's childhood 20 years later the village was gradually being absorbed into the slums cast off by an adjacent provincial town called Kotlasada. Her father became a heroin addict and died of it. Her mother slept around for money and favors, and she herself at 14 became the plaything of a small landowner's son. Then a suitor appeared, strutting the village on leave from his job in the city, and plucked her off to Lahore. He looked so slim and city-bright, and soon proved to be not only weak but depraved. These experiences had not cracked her hard skin, but made her sensual, unscrupulous, and romantic. One morning she lay on the bed of the cramped servants' quarters in Lahore where she and her husband lived. He was gone for the day, aimless and sloping around the streets, unwanted at the edge of the crowd in a tea stall. Though he knew right away that she slept with Hassan the cook, in this house where she served as a maid, the first time he opened his mouth she made to slap him and pushed him out of the room, and next day as usual he hungrily took the few rupees she gave, to buy twists of rocket pills, his amphetamine addiction. She picked at the chipped polish on her long slim toe, feeling sorry for herself. Her oval face, taller than broad, with deep-set eyes, had a grace contrasting with her bright easy temperament. At 24 this hard life had not yet marked her, and when she smiled her dimples made her seem even younger. Just a girl, she still had some of the girl's gravity. It was true, the cook Hassan had gotten everything from her, as always she'd given it too soon. She had been a maidservant in 3 houses so far, since her husband lost his job as peon in an office, and in every one she had opened her legs for the cook. She'd been here at Gulfishan, the Lahore mansion of the landlord Harouni, only a month, and already she'd slept with Hassan. The cooks tempted her, lording it over the kitchen, where she liked to sit, with the smell of broth and green vegetables cooking and sauce. And she had duties in the kitchen. She made the chapatis, so thin and light that they almost floated up to the ceiling. She had that in her hands. Mr. Harouni had called her into the dining room at lunch one day and said he'd never in 70 years eaten better ones, while she blushed and looked at her bare feet. And then, the delicacies that Hassan gave her, the best parts, things that should have gone to the table, foreign things, pistachio ice cream and slices of sweet pies, baked tomatoes stuffed with cheese, potato cutlets. Things that she asked for, village food, curry with marrow bones and carrot halva. The entire household, from the sahib on down, had been eating to suit her appetite. "Ask for it, my duckling," said Hassan in the mornings, when she drank her tea sitting beside him, hunched together in the kitchen. "I need to fatten you up, I like them plump." "Don't talk that way, I come from a respectable family." "Well, whatever kind of family, what should I stuff that rounded little belly with today?" And he wobbled off to market on his bicycle with a big woven basket strapped on the back, riding so slowly that he could almost have walked there faster, pedaling with his knees pointed out. But that had ended soon enough. Why are cooks always vicious? She knew that at lunchtime today she would go silently into the kitchen and begin making the chapatis, that Hassan would be standing at the stove, banging lids, ignoring her. She hadn't done anything. She had told the slut sweepress who was always hanging around the kitchen to fuck off somewhere else, and he exploded. Hassan ruled the hot filthy kitchen. He made food both for the master's table and for all the servants, more than a dozen of them. For days on end the servants' food would be inedible, keeping with Hassan's policy of collective punishment. Once, when the accounts manager had quite mildly commented on Hassan's reckless padding of the bills, they had eaten nothing but watery lentils for more than a week, until the manager backed down. "Well, I've got to cut corners somewhere," Hassan kept saying, shaking his grizzled head. Anyway, Saleema knew that he was through with her, would sweeten up and try to fuck her now and then, out of cruelty as much as anything else, to show he could, but the easy days were over, now she had no one to protect her. In this household a man who had served 10 years counted as a new servant. Hassan had been there over 50, Rafiq, the master's valet, the same. Even the nameless junior gardener had been there. 4 or 5. With less than a month's service Saleema counted for nothing. Nor did she have patronage. She had been hired on approval, to serve the master's eldest daughter, Begum Kamila, who lived in New York, and who that spring had come to stay with her father. Haughty and proud, Kamila allowed no intimacies. Saleema next angled for one of the drivers, Forlorn Hope. A large man with a drooping mustache who didn't ever speak to her. The two drivers shared quarters, a room next to the cool dark garage where 2 aging Mercedes stood, rarely driven, because the old man rarely went out. Day and night the drivers kept up a revolving card game, with the blades from a nearby slum, the fast set. She would linger past the door of the room where they sprawled on a raft of beds. At night they sometimes drank beer, hiding the bottles on the floor. As she walked past their room a second time on a breezy spring morning, one of the men in the room whistled. "Go to hell," she said. That made it worse. "Give us some of that black mango. It's a new variety." "No, it's smooth like ice cream, I swear to God my tongue is melting." "You can wipe your dipstick after checking the oil." One of them pretended to be defending her. "How dare you say that?" She went into the latrine, holding back her tears. She didn't even have a place to herself for that, she shared the same toilet as the men. The dark room stank, there were cockroaches in the corners. She closed the wooden door of the stall behind her, pushed her face and arms against the flaking whitewashed wall, and began softly to cry. "What is it, girl?" Someone must have been in the shower, next to the toilet. Usually she called before entering. "Who the hell is that?" "Stay in there, my clothes are on the wall. I'm just finished." She recognized the voice of Rafiq, the valet. "You can go to hell too. I'm done with you fuckheads." "That's all right, quiet down, I'm just leaving." His thin arm reached to take the clothes hanging from a nail pounded into the wall behind the door. She heard him dress and go out, pulling the door shut gently. She squatted in the dark, pulling down her shalver and trying to pee. Nothing came. His voice had been gentle. 3 bars of light filtered across the air above her head, alive with motes of dust, and this filled her with hope. The summer would be here in a month, the cold winter had passed. She loved the heat, thick night air, and the smell of water and dust, the cool shower spraying her breasts, water splashing on the furry walls in the dank room, and her body, coming out into the evening, drying her hair, head sideways, ear to her shoulder, combing its hanging length. Rafiq sat in the servants' courtyard on one of the dirty white metal chairs, smoking a hookah, not looking at her as she sat down on a low wooden stool, almost at his knees. He cupped the mouthpiece of the hookah with blunt weathered hands, a heavy agate ring on his index finger. She had never before looked closely at Rafiq. He wore clean plain clothes, a woolen mountain vest, spoke with the curling phlegmy accent of the Salt Range, despite having served in Lahore for 50 years. Black shoes cracked where the toes bent, polished. He said the 5 daily prayers, the only servant who did. A week earlier he had dyed his hair red with henna, to keep him cool as summer came. Hair parted in the middle, looking almost martial but without any swagger, a small brush of mustache, thick ears of an aging man. He must be 60, came into service as a boy, 50 years ago. He spent more time with the master than anyone else, woke the old man and put him to bed, brought him tea, massaged his feet, dressed him, brought him a single whiskey at night. All of old Lahore knew Rafik, the barons, the landlords and magnates and politicians, the old dragons, the hostesses of 40 years ago. She let herself cry a few more tears. She could cry whenever she wanted. She thought of herself, alone, her husband on drugs, that dried up stick who picked her out of the village, when she thought he was saving her. She was still a girl, not just then, but now too. She cried harder, wiping her eyes with the corner of her dupatta. Rafik's mouth worked, distorting his patient resigned face. He took a long pull on the hookah, the tobacco thick in the air. They were alone. They could hear Hassan in the kitchen making lunch. Pounding something. The drivers sat in their quarters playing cards, the gardeners tended their plants, the sweepers were in the house washing the toilets or the floors, or sweeping the leaves from the long tree-shaded drive at the front of the house. "I know what you all think," she began. "You think I'm a slut, you think I poison my husband. Because of him I'm alone, and you all do with me as you like. I'm trying to live here too, you know. I'm not a fool. I also come from somewhere." Her words poured out clearly, evenly, angrily, entirely unplanned. He didn't say anything, smoked, his heavy-lidded eyes half shut. After a moment she got up to leave. "Stay a minute, girl. I'll bring you tea." He shifted to get up, putting aside the bamboo stem of the hookah. "All right, uncle. But let me bring it." His offering this meant so much to her. Going boldly into the kitchen, she ladled tea into 2 chipped cups, the servant's crockery, from a kettle that simmered on a back burner morning until night. Hassan ignored her. She brought the cups and handed one to Rafik, hoping as she sat down on a bench that someone would come and see them together. Touching the hot tea to her lips, she peered at him. He poured tea into the saucer and blew the clotted cream away, then sipped. "It's good, isn't it?" he said. She wanted to stop it, because it seemed too soon after her tears, but a smile came over her, rising up. She beamed, her girlish yet knowing face lit and transformed. "What are you laughing at?" "Nothing. You look like my uncle, except he was huge and fat and you're thin." He always blew on his tea and then he sipped it and looked sort of gloomy and important, like you do. "Gloomy?" He said it in the funniest way, startled. "I can get him," she thought, and it sent a shiver of happiness through her. "I'm just joking with you. You're completely different from my uncle. Is that better?" He smiled, not as a grown-up does, but like a child, smiling with his eyes and mouth and the wrinkles bitten into his face, cheerfully. She noticed this, and thought, he smiles all over, the same way I do. "You're making fun of me." "Well, go ahead, I'm an old man. It's time for me to be a fool." She thought of disagreeing with him, saying he would never be a fool, but stopped herself. Instead she said, "Well, whatever time it is, I don't think foolishness wears a watch." "You're full of riddles, little girl." Little girl. Finishing her tea, she took both her cup and his into the kitchen and washed them carefully. Going out again and walking past him, she said, "Thank you, I feel better for talking to you, uncle." In her room, she sat on the bed cross-legged, closed her eyes, leaned back against the wall, and thought, after all, why not? Why shouldn't I? Saleema avoided Rafik during the next few days, watching him, but not presuming on the intimacy of their one conversation. She had never been discreet, so that although she did this almost unconsciously, it suggested to her new possibilities of relation, defined not by constraint, which she understood, but by delicacy. Then fate stepped in to reward her. Every year, at the time of the wheat harvest, Harouni went for a week to his farm at Dinyapu, on the banks of the Indus. His daughter Begum Kamila that year accompanied him, and therefore Saleema went too. Early on the morning of the departure the two cars stood in front of the house, one under the portico, for the Sahib and Kamila, and the other for the servants. The drivers polished the cars while they waited, leaning over to clean the windshields, experts. Saleema had tied her clothes in a bag. She had bought a new pair of sandals the day before, and now the red plastic straps were cutting into her feet. When the master came out, leaning on Rafiq's arm, those who were sitting on their haunches stood up sharply. He got into the car, called Shah Sahib the accounts manager over, spoke to him briefly through the lowered window, and then the car pulled away, passed under the alley of ancient flame of the forest trees, and turned out the gate. Everyone relaxed. Shah Sahib lit a cigarette, looked without interest over the scene, and returned to his office. Come on, get it done," Samunda Khan driver said to the gardeners, who were loading provisions into the trunk of the second car. Come on, get it done," Samunda Khan driver said to the gardeners, who were loading provisions into the trunk of the second car. Hassan sat in the front, wearing a lambskin cap that brushed the roof, Rafiq and Saleema in the back, a basket of food on the seat between them. She had never before ridden in a private car. Sitting with her hands on her knees, she looked out the window at the old shops along the mall, Tollington Market, where Hassan went on his bicycle to buy chickens and meat, then the mausoleum of Dutta Sahib. I suppose people looking in must wonder who I am, she thought. As they came across the Ravi River Bridge she asked if she could open her window, not so much because she wanted to, as to register her presence. Hassan and Samunda Khan were arguing about whether the fish in the river had been getting bigger or smaller in the last few years. "Oh, for God's sake," said Hassan, "what do you know about it? I'm a cook, and I've been cooking fish longer than you've been breathing. Listen to me, once upon a time the fish used to be half as big as this car. For you old guys everything used to be bigger." With Hassan, this could go on for hours. Saleema asked again, "Can I open the window please?" They were stuck in traffic going through the toll. "Go ahead," Samunda Khan said. "The air's free." She couldn't find the handle. Rafiq leaned over and touched the button, and the window glided down. He pointed out at the river. The rising sun threw a broad stripe of orange on the chocolate-brown water. Bicycles and donkey carts and gaudy Bedford trucks streamed in and out of the city over the bridge. He gestured with his eyes at Samunda Khan and Hassan debating nonsense in the front. "Wisdom against youth," he whispered. Saleema drove back into her childhood, through towns the same as those around her home 100 miles to the east, rows of ugly concrete buildings, crowded bazaars, slums, ponds of sewage water choked with edible water lilies, then open country, groves of blossoming orange trees, the ripe mustard yellow with flowers, but she rode in an immaculate car instead of a bus crashing along thick with the odor of the crowd. She had painted her nails the night before, her hand rested on the sill of the window, the spring air brushing her fingers. She felt pretty. They drove through mango orchards, fields of harvest wheat. Rafiq sat telling a rosary of worn plastic beads, mouthing the 99 names of Allah, his eyes dull, allowing the landscape to pass through him. They turned onto a single-lane road, which led first through barren salt flats, then irrigated fields, and finally into an orchard of old mango trees. "All this belongs to Mian Sahib," said Rafiq. They drove up a packed dirt road bordered with jasmine, along the brick wall that enclosed the house, running for several acres, and then into a cul-de-sac planted with rosewood trees. 10 or 12 men sat on benches and stools, the managers and others who wanted to be noticed by the landowner. Rafiq stepped out of the car and embraced them one by one. Several of them looked over at Saleema and said, "Salam, BBG." After they had tea, Rafik said to her, "Come on, I'll show you where Begum Kamila's room is." They went through an ornate wooden door, set in the wall, and into a lush garden that stretched away and became lost among banyans and rosewood trees and open lawns. She paused, shading her eyes with her hand, taking in the green sward. "There's more than you can see. If you like, I'll show you later." Walking through a grassy courtyard, Rafik came to a door, removed his shoes, and knocked. "Come in," called Begum Kamila. She was sitting in an armchair reading a book. "So you've come, have you?" She must once have been a very beautiful woman. She wore bright saris and colored her long hair jet black, and on her third finger she wore an immense emerald set in gold, which Saleema once found lying next to the bathtub, and held in her palm for a long time, feeling the heft of the stone, guessing what it must be worth. "Shall I light the fire, Begum Sahiba?" asked Rafik. "Go ahead, it'll take away the damp. I suppose Daddy's about to call for lunch." Rafik kneeled in front of the fire, twisting sheets of newspaper into sticks. Kamila's bags had been placed on a long desk by the window, which overlooked another garden. Lines had been chalked in the grass for tennis and a net strung. Saleema took the toiletries into the bathroom and laid them out. Unlike the house in Lahore, where the doors were smudged with fingerprints and the paint flaked off the walls in strips, these rooms had been newly painted. The rugs were bright and clean, the brick floors had been washed, vases of flowers, badly arranged, had been placed all around, marigolds and roses. Going out again into the dark, chilly bedroom, Saleema found Rafik still kneeling at the hearth, the flames orange on his orange face. "Is Bibi gone?" They announced lunch. "May I sit down?" He moved over. "It's amazing. My village would fit in a corner of this garden, and we were 30 families. And it's so clean and comfortable, out here in the middle of nowhere. Harouni Sahib is a lord, and we're poor people. And then, these are the games that the managers play. The better the house and gardens look, the more comfortable he is, the less Mian Sahib notices the tricks they all get up to on the farms. I don't know what they're storing it up for, stealing fertilizer and the water and cheating in the books. In the old days no one dared. Mian Sahib made these people, the fathers ate his salt, and now the sons have forgotten and are eating everything else." The fire cracked, the dry mango wood catching hungrily. She threw a little twig into the fire. "At least their bellies are full." In the morning she washed Begum Kamila's clothes, sitting by a faucet outside in the back garden, beside the unused tennis court. Foam on her arms, water splashing onto her bodice from the big orange bucket, she looked up at the trees blowing in the wind, the birds. She was alone. The swayback tennis net and the odd chalked lines made the lawn seem expectant, prepared. Last night she had taken a bowl of food quickly into her own room. She heard the men outside around a fire telling stories about the old tough managers and light-fingered servants, now dead, or about happenings on the farm, cattle thefts, dowries. Hassan and Rafik and even the drivers, who had after all been in service 15 or 20 years, had old friends here. Churning the clothes in the bucket, squeezing them out, she felt happier perhaps than she ever had been. The April sun had bite, even in the morning, reflecting off the whitewashed walls enclosing this back garden. The earth cooled the soles of her bare feet. Her thoughts ducked in and out of holes, like mice. "I'll avoid him," she thought, settling on this as a way forward, knowing that she would be seeing Rafik at lunch if not before. Her love affairs had been so plainly mercantile transactions that she hadn't learned to be coquettish. But the little hopeful girl in her awoke now. Spreading the clothes to dry on a long hedge that bordered the tennis court, bright red and white and yellow patches against the healthy green, she sat there alone in the sun until lunchtime, undisturbed except once, by a gardener, who walked past with a can, stooping to water the potted plants arranged next to the building. At lunch she made the chapatis. No one in the village could do that properly. Hassan came into the big hot kitchen, which had a row of coal-burning hearths set at waist level in one wall, and lifted the covers off the saucepans and casseroles prepared by the farm cook, enough for several dozen people. "Hey, boy," he said to the gangly farm cook, "I've never heard of chickens with 6 legs. I suppose you're one of those guys. If you cooked a fly you'd keep the breast for yourself. At least you could waft it past your lord and master once." He pinched Saleema under her arm as she stood flattening the chapatis between her hands. "Here's where the real meat is." He laughed without mirth, a drawn-out wheeze. The young cook didn't know what to say. He hadn't slipped anything away yet, though he certainly planned to. Rafik stood beside another servant, who was spooning the food into serving dishes. The room had high ceilings and a long wooden table in the middle. In the old times food for scores of people had been cooked here, when the master came on weeks-long hunting trips, with large parties and beaters and guides. Fans that had been broken for years hung down on long pipes, like in a railway station hall. Saleema had become rigid when Hassan pinched her, raising her shoulders but keeping her eyes on the skillet. Resting a hand on Hassan's shoulder, Rafik said, "Uncle, why do you bother this poor girl? What has she done to you?" "You should ask, what hasn't she done to me?" Then, after a moment, "The hell with it, she's a virgin ever since she rode across the river. How's that? Don't uncle me, when you're my own uncle." He threw down his apron, and left the kitchen, saying to the village cook, "Watch out for Kamila Bibi, young man. Mian Sahib doesn't care what he eats." As he walked past Saleema, carrying a tray of food to the living room, Rafik made a funny stiff face and then winked. That evening the weather changed. This wasn't the season for rain, but just before dark the wind from the north had begun to blow across the plain, bending the branches of the rosewood trees like a closed hand running up the trunk to strip off the leaves, throwing in front of it a scattering of crows, which flew sloping and tumbling like scraps of black cotton. The rain spattered and made pox in the dust, cold as rain is before hail. Then it fell heavily. Rafik had taken the drinks into the living room at 7, as he did every day. The food sat warming over coals. There was nothing further to be done until the bell for dinner rang at 8:30. The others were in the veranda of the servants' sitting area. Saleema leaned against the long table, while across from her Rafik sat on a stool. The dim bulbs with tin shades hanging from the ceiling threw a yellow light which left the corners of the room dark. Neither of them could think of anything to say, and Saleema kept wiping her eyes and her face with her dupatta as if she were hot. When the rain became hard she said, "Come on, let's go see it come down." They walked awkwardly through the empty dining room, which smelled of dust and damp brick, then through an arcade to the back veranda. A single banyan tree stood in the middle of the back lawn, the rain cascading down through its hand's-breadth leaves. Saleema leaned against a pillar. Rafik stood next to her, his hands behind his back. "God forgive us, there's going to be a lot of damage to the straw that hasn't been covered," he said. "This will even knock down the wheat that hasn't been cut. Look at how hard it's coming down." She looked over at him, his serious wrinkled face, his stubble. Despite the rain, moths circled around the lamps hanging from the ceiling. She kept bumping her hip against the pillar. Come on, she thought. "Finally," he said, "well at least they haven't started planting the cotton yet." She turned, with her back to the pillar. "Rafik, we're both from the village, we know all this." He looked over at her quickly. His face seemed hard. She had startled him. Then he did come over. She put her arms around him. "You're thin," she said, as if she were pleading, "you should eat more," exhaling. The water splashed in the gutter spouts. He also pulled her into his body and held her, melted into her. She was almost exactly as tall as him, his thin body and hers muscular and young. He kissed her neck, not like a man kissing a woman, but inexpertly, as if he were kissing a baby. She kept her eyes open, face on his shoulder. The electricity went, with a sort of crack, night extinguishing the house and the rain-swept garden. "Let's go, little girl," he whispered in her ear. "They'll be calling for me." In the darkness, with the other servants hurrying to bring lamps and candles, no one noticed when Saleema and Rafik returned to the kitchen. But the next morning, when the servants were eating their parathas and tea, he came over and sat down next to her, saying nothing, sipping the tea and chewing noisily because of his false teeth, his mouth rotating. So everyone knew. After that he ate his meals next to her, and when they had no duties they went off into the empty back garden and sat talking. But they didn't make love, or even do more than hold hands. At the end of the week Harouni and his retinue drove back to Lahore, Rafik, Saleema, and the rest. The servants had a game that they played, with Rafik surprisingly enough not just acquiescent but the ringleader. Up in Rafik's native mountains marijuana grew everywhere, along the sides of the roads, and thickest along the banks of open sores running through the rocky pine woods below the villages, the blooming plants at the end of summer competing in sweetness and stench with the odor of sewage. Hash smoke clouded the late-night air in the little village tea stall when he was a young man. Now, every spring Rafik planted a handful of seeds behind some trees in a corner of the Lahore garden, and in the fall he dried the plants and ground up the leaves. He played tricks on the others, making a paste called bang and slipping it into the food of one or another servant. Sometimes they would taste it and stop eating, but often not. A few weeks after the visit to the Harouni farm at Daniyal, Rafik began secretly compounding a batch of his potion in his quarters, with the help of Saleema. Kamila Bibi had gone back to New York, but Saleema had been kept on, through Rafik's intervention. The accounts manager Shah Sahib had been planning to tell the master that the girl was corrupt and a bad character, saying these words in English, and toss her out. But now he held his tongue, not wanting to cross Rafik. And Rafik spoke for her one evening as the old man went to sleep, with Rafik massaging his legs. "I beg your pardon, sir, about the maid Saleema who has been serving Begum Kamila. She's a poor girl and her husband is sick and she's useful in the kitchen. She makes the chapatis. If you can give her a place it would be a blessing." The old man did not merely lack interest in the affairs of the servants, he was not conscious that they had lives outside his purview. "That's fine." Now Saleema watched in Rafik's quarters as he boiled the dried leaves in water over an electric ring. "Hey, girl, close the door. Don't let anyone see." She sat down on the edge of the bed, swinging her bare feet, kicking off her sandals, which fell by the door. Rafik squatted, stirring the leaves with a wooden spoon and peering into the cauldron. They still hadn't made love, though now he would lie with her in the afternoon during the servants' nap time, his hand on her breasts. He made no attempt to hide their relations, and all the servants thought they must be sleeping together. She would fold him into her body, and stroke his thinning hennaed hair while he slept. "This is a strange kind of cooking for an old man. You're the strange one, following this old man around like a little sheep. Most shepherds are young boys." "Please don't say that." She never in her life had spoken in these gentle tones. He looked up at her, eyes smiling, pointing with the spoon. "Be careful or I'll give you a taste of this." "No thanks." "No, I'm serious. When Mian Sahib goes to Pindi I want everyone to take some. I'll have it too." "Are you kidding? It'll be fun. And we'll be together. You can trust me." 2 days later Harouni flew to Rawalpindi, to attend a meeting of the Board of Governors of the State Bank, one of the few positions he still held, a sinecure. The real policy was decided elsewhere. Harouni and other eminences unknowingly acting to camouflage self-serving deals and manipulations. Shah Sahib, who had accompanied his master to the airport, stood next to Samunda Khan in the parking lot, leaning against the hood of the car, wearing a grey suit with excessively broad lapels. A jet taxied out and came hurtling down the runway, then climbed smoothly through haze, toward Rawalpindi to the west, locking its wheels up. "Let's go," said Shah Sahib. As they drove out the airport gate, Samunda Khan said, "May I take you home?" Shah Sahib glanced over at him. "I need to pick up some things for my wife. Then you can take me home." "Well, Shah Sahib's out of the way," Samunda Khan said, walking into the kitchen. Hassan stood at the stove over an enormous pot of boiling oil, cooking the samosas, which Rafiq and Saleema were assembling at a table, filling them with meat and bang. Rafiq had told the servants that he would be passing around samosas to celebrate good news from home, but everyone saw through this. The drivers and their gang were fully on board, and had sent Samunda Khan to make sure they got a heaping plate. The old gardener had left, but the younger one had sidled into the driver's quarters and wanted to join in. The oldest of the sweepers, a thin balding man with a meek, servile expression, sat out in the courtyard hoping that he would be included. Whenever he could afford it, he would buy himself a stick of hash to smoke at home after the day's work. All the bang had been used up. A pile of samosas steamed in a plate. "Okay, now it's us," said Rafiq. Hassan turned his back and raised the lid on a saucepan. "Not me." But he ended up having some. Saleema and Rafiq sat in his room eating samosas. At first she had refused, but he pressed her. "Now what?" she said. "Sit here and tell me a story. Tell me about when you were a girl." Neither of them had spoken much of their pasts or their homes. She knew that he had a wife and children, 2 sons, and shied away from anything bringing it to mind. "What shall I say? I was brought up with slaps and harsh words. We had nothing, we were poor. My father sold vegetables from a cart, but when he began smoking heroin he sold everything, the cart, his bicycle, the radio, even the dishes in the kitchen. Once a man, a boy, gave me a little watch, he brought it from Multan, and my father pushed me to the ground and took it from my wrist. Poor girl, little girl, how could he do it? He rolled her over onto the bed and kissed her neck, under her chin. Stopping for a moment, he stood and locked the door. She didn't tell him the worst, much worse things. Her father came into her room at night and felt under her clothes. For the first time, Rafiq touched between her legs. She opened the drawstring of her shalvar, then took off her shirt, sitting up on the bed. Her small breasts stood out, her ribs. He turned off the lights, but she said, "No, I want to see you." "This old body? Leave it, there's nothing to see. For me you're not old." The bang had begun to affect her. She felt the dimensions of the room, the light, the calendar on the wall that showed a picture of the Kaaba, the black cloths covering the stone and crowds circling around it. How strange, she had never before seen the roof, made of bricks and metal rods, the little high window to let in air. She felt aroused, yet wanted to get up, to go somewhere. She took off his clothes, peeling off his tan socks. Their skin touched. Standing up and going to the corner, she bent down on purpose to pick up her shirt, letting him see her. She saw reflected in his eyes the beauty of her young body. They made love, he came almost immediately, then lay on her. "Stay inside of me," she said. Her thoughts were racing, from idea to idea. Oh, would he marry her? And she knew he wouldn't. She had been taken by so many men, could have given herself to him so much more pure. "Now turn off the lights," she said. "No, let's go out in a minute. Let's go in the garden and look at the flowers." In the garden he even held her hand. Don't be afraid, he said. If you have strange thoughts, remember it's the bang. Be happy. Well, it's warm, she said. The sun beat down, the dust on the roses seemed heavy, under a banyan tree the grass didn't grow. She kicked off her shoes, felt the cool earth. Lie down here, she said, next to me, hold me. And though they might have been seen, he did. All the afternoon they walked around together, even in the house, looking at the paintings, the furniture. Rafik wanted to sit with the drivers, but she said no, she wanted to be with him alone. Hassan banged around the kitchen, he had eaten too many of the samosas. That evening she said to Rafik, I'll be back in half an hour. She went to her own room. Her husband lay on the bed, on his pills, twitching his fingers. Look, she said, standing over him. You're a mess. You've been a mess for 2 years. Now I'll never sleep in your bed again. He began to cry, his emaciated face, his long yellow teeth. This she hadn't expected. He sobbed, real tears. She sat down on the broken chair in the corner, looking at the shelf on which she kept her few things, a metal jar of eyeliner, a tin box thrown out by Camila that once held chocolates. Will I still get my money? Then she stood up again. Yes, but if you ever say one funny word, that's it. She took some clothes, and when she hung them from a nail in Rafik's room he said nothing. She held him all night, his face in her breasts. Only once, waking, she thought, that was our marriage feast, drugged samosas, and she felt sad and worn and frightened. Now she slept each night in Rafik's bed, leaving her husband to his addiction. Fall and winter came, the leaves fell, at night they slept under a heavy quilt that the managers at the farm sent to Rafik as a present. She slept naked, which still after 5 months disturbed him. Rafik woke before dawn, to say his prayers, then went into the kitchen and had tea with Hassan. The Sahib woke early, and Rafik had duties until mid-morning. When he came to wake her, she would pretend still to be asleep, face hidden in the quilt. She always slept with her head covered. He would bring a cup of tea and some toast. Come in with me, she would say, moving over in the bed, leaving a warm spot, and sometimes he would. Her long hair hung down, and she would brush it, while he told her about the guests who had come for bridge, or about some feud in the kitchen. He read the Urdu paper New Times, sitting in the morning sun, wearing ancient horn-rimmed glasses with thick lenses. She bought him a warm woolen hat and carefully washed and mended his clothes. She wanted everyone to see how well she cared for him. She said, "You wear me on your back, and I wear you on my face." Her face had softened. She missed one period, then a second, but said nothing to Rafik. They had finished making love one afternoon, and were talking, her head on his shoulder. He was stroking her belly. "I might as well tell you. See how I'm bigger? I'm pregnant." He pushed her head away and sat up. "That's bad. If that's how you feel, I'll go to my village and get rid of it. I'm married. I have a son your age." She got out of bed, dressed, and went out, turning for a moment at the door. "I'll never forget what you said when I told you." "Where to go?" She walked out the gate, in the direction of Lawrence Gardens, a few blocks away. Looking up into the cradle of branches in an enormous flame of the forest tree, she thought, "God, I'm nothing, look at how small I am next to this tree. It must be hundreds of years old. But I won't give up the baby. I'd rather have the baby than Rafik." That night she had nowhere else to sleep, and so went into Rafik's quarters. She couldn't bear to be with her husband, who used more and more of the rocket pills and stayed up all night smoking cigarettes. "Forgive me," Rafik said. "I'm going to have it, you can keep me here or throw me out. In any case, I'll have it in my village, there are no women here to help me." The next day he went to the bazaar in the morning, And when she came to his room for the afternoon nap, he gave her a tiny suit, blue knitted trousers, a blue shirt, mittens, and a hat with a pom-pom, printed with little white rabbits. So he accepted her condition and would run his hands over her growing belly, speaking to the life within. When it moved, she would put his hand there to show him. None of the other servants said anything openly, though they had expected it, and of course she could claim it was her husband's child. Hassan once jokingly congratulated her, but she responded so gently that he too became silent. Rafik obtained a month's leave for her. Before she left for the village, he gave her a lot of money, 10,000 rupees, which he had saved up over the years, even after sending maintenance to his family. I can't take this. For me, for our baby, in case you need a doctor. She arrived at her village at dusk, taking a rickshaw from the bus station. The open field next to the village had become a collecting pool for the sewage from the city, the water black. Look, Saleema's come, the neighbors said, as she walked through the narrow lane to her mother's house, carrying 2 plastic bags full of food, meat and sugar, tea, carrots, potatoes. The walled compound didn't have a door, just a dirty burlap cloth made of 2 gunny sacks sewn together. Children ran behind her and peeked in. Her mother sat on a charpoy, peeling potatoes, her long thin hair braided and red with henna. She didn't even get up, she kept peeling the potatoes. I'm back. Are you in trouble? You're pregnant? No, she lied. I bought a goat with the money you sent. I can see. The goat, tied to a stake, nibbled at a handful of grass. The single room was almost completely bare, not even a radio. Saleema made a curry, kneeling by the little hearth, over a fire of twigs. As they ate, sitting on the bed, Saleema asked, "Where's my brother? Bolu doesn't come here much. I don't give him money. Where do you get money besides what I send? It isn't easy anymore, that I can tell you. You'll find out someday what it's like to be old. I sweep the Chaudhry's house, I sell milk from the goat." The next day she told her mother about Rafik and the baby. "Did your husband throw you out? I forgot about him long ago." She wanted to explain that she had become a respectable woman, but knew that her mother would never understand. Her mother found out about the money and wheedled day and night. Saleema kept the money in a pouch that she wore under her shirt. Late one night, she woke to find her mother stealthily untying the pouch with thin practiced hands. When Saleema sat up, her mother at first said, "I thought I saw a scorpion." Then, "You owe me, you gravid bitch, coming here puffed up after your whoring. This isn't a hotel. It's not my money. And I've been buying all the food. It sure seems like your money." The mother lay in her bed, coughing. The old midwife from the village, with filthy hands and a greedy heart, brought the baby into the world, a little boy. Rafik immediately bonded with his son. He had been in Lahore when his other children, conceived during 10-day leaves, were born and grew up. He named the child Allah Baksh, God-gifted one. Saleema sat leaning against the wall of the quarters while Rafik played with the little baby, which held his finger in its tiny hand. He clapped and made a crooning sound, until the baby laughed, showing its red toothless gums. "His teeth are like yours. Plus you two think alike." She saw that Rafik really did think like the baby. He would sit all afternoon playing with it, engaged with it and seeing the world through its eyes, until it tired. When she opened her blouse to feed the baby, Rafik would look away, embarrassed, lighting his hookah as a distraction, while it smacked and sucked, its tiny throat moving. Happy months passed, then a year. Saleema became more rounded, she was at the peak of her strange long-faced beauty. Her breasts were heavy with milk. Rafik sat cross-legged on the lawn one morning, holding the baby. He heard the screen door leading from Harouni's room open, and the master came out. Rafik quickly stood up. "Salam, sir." "Hello, Rafik." He was in a good mood. "Is this Saleema's baby?" The master touched the baby with the flat of his hand. The baby, which had been sleeping, smacked its lips. Rafik always dressed him too warmly, a knitted suit with feet, a floppy hat. "I must say, he's the spitting image of you," Harouni said, teasingly. Rafik's face broke involuntarily into a broad smile. "What can I say? Hazua, life takes strange turns. These are all your honor's blessings." Harouni shouted with laughter. "There are some blessings that you shouldn't attribute to me." The old retainer's gentle face colored. A letter arrived from Rafik's wife. He kept it in his pocket all day, and that night showed it to Saleema. She literally began trembling, sat down on the bed with her head bowed. "Will you read it to me?" "All right." The village Molvi had taught Rafik to read as a boy, so that he could recite the Quran. He took his battered glasses from a case in his front pocket and began. "Assalamu alaikum. I am writing to you because you have not been home in so many months, more than 18 months, and your sons, and also I miss you and speak of you at night. The old buffalo died, but the younger one had 2 calves, both female, so we will have plenty of milk, though for a short while we have none. Khalid asks to come to Lahore and find a job there. You can find a job for him, perhaps with God's help. Your brother's shop was robbed, but they found no money, and now he wants to buy 2 malas of land, so he will not have cash, which is better. The land is on the other side of Afzal's piece. Everything else is well. Please, dear husband, come home when Mian Sahib can spare you. We all send our respects." As he read the salam, Rafik had breathed, "Va alaykum assalam." She had signed the letter, written by a neighbor, with an X. "Look," said Rafik. She wept on the paper. "Or watered it." "What will you do?" "I'll have to go." She turned her face to the wall and held herself rigid when he touched her. "Have I done you some wrong?" "No," she said, "I've done you wrong. My wife is 60 years old, little girl. She and I have been together for almost 50. She stood by me, she bore me 2 sons, she kept my house, my honor has always been perfectly safe in her hands." "Honor," Saleema began to cry. "That's bad. You're tiring of me in this situation. Imagine how it feels for me." He tried to reassure her, but she could tell that the letter had shaken him, as a man of principle. The baby and her love had made him gentler and more philosophical, taking a long view of life as he began to grow old, but the same gentleness would bend him toward his duty, which always would be to his wife and grown sons. He would punish himself and thus her for not loving his wife and for loving Saleema so much and so carnally. She made him give her a phone number before he left, of a shop near his house, and every evening she wanted to use it. The paper burned in her pocket, but she never dared. What would she say? Who would she say was calling? When he returned to Lahore, he had changed. He had told his wife about little Alaboksha. A few days later, Rafik's son and his wife came to stay in the Lahore house. Saleema was dusting the living room and happened to see them arrive, through a window looking out onto the drive in front. She heard the harsh puttering of a rickshaw, and then an old woman emerged, led by a young man with glistening hair and a strong manner. She knew immediately who this must be, her destruction come in this feeble guise. Panic overcame her, mixed with jealousy and a strange pride that came of knowing they had traveled with her in their minds, planning against her. She watched as they walked up the drive and through the passage to the servants' area. Suddenly remembering her son, who was with Rafik, she raced through the house to the back. But she arrived too late. The old woman had come to the quarters and found Rafik playing with the baby. Saleema walked past the open door, pretending to be on some errand, expecting to hear shouting and tears. The old woman sitting on the bed looked up at Saleema with rheumy eyes that expressed neither reproach nor disliking but simply a flat dismissal. She knew who this young girl must be. Rafik brought the child to Saleema's quarters, where she had retreated. "At least this one belongs to me," she whispered. The grown son, when he met Saleema later that afternoon in the servants' sitting area, said to her, "Salam, auntie. I'm younger than you, you country fool," she thought spitefully. She would much rather have been attacked, for then she could react. That night she sat in the kitchen until midnight, the sleeping baby in her arms, watching the cockroaches scurry across the dirty floor. Finally going to her own room, she roughly pushed her husband over on the bed. He had become so thin that his face looked like a broken steel lantern, a gash of mouth and skin stretched over wires. "Don't smoke," she ordered. "And don't touch me, stay against the wall. I lost all that long ago." He knew why she had come back to his bed. Lying and staring at the ceiling, nursing the baby when it woke, she felt her love for Rafik tearing at her breast, making her a stranger to herself, breaking her. Now she slept again next to this man who disgusted her, while her love must be sleeping beside his ancient wife, who had known him in his youth, who knew all about him. How she loved the baby, its tiny feet and hands, its contented smacking noises and warmth beside her. The next day she hid in her room with the doors closed. When Rafik knocked, she said, "Please, I beg you. You'll only hurt me. Tell them I'm sick, and leave me alone." "Are you sick?" he asked, concerned. "What do you think?" She heard his measured footsteps walking away. She thought, if just once he would act rashly or even quickly, suddenly, without thinking. But he wouldn't. She remembered how slowly he had surrendered to her. 3 days passed. She and Rafik barely spoke, and when they passed each other she saw from his broken and haunted look that he missed her as she missed him. Yet also she saw how resolutely he had turned from her. Just once, when they were alone in the kitchen, at night, he reached over and touched her hand. "You know, don't you?" he said. The well inside her stirred, all the sorrows of her life, the sweet thick fluid in that darkness, which always lay at the bottom of her thoughts, from which she pulled up the cool liquid and drank. "I know." And they knew that she forgave him. Still she hoped. The wife sat in Rafik's room all day, the door open, cross-legged on the bed, eyes not responding to passers-by, heavy and settled. Saleema couldn't help walking past on her way to the latrine. One morning very early she heard the master's bell ring, and then people rushing around. She rose and went to the kitchen. Hassan told her as soon as she walked in, "The old man's sick, they are taking him to the hospital." The other servants milled around the kitchen, no one spoke. The household rested on Harouni's shoulders, their livelihoods. Late that night he died. The daughters had come, Camila from New York, her sister Sawat from Karachi. Even Rehanna, the estranged middle daughter, who lived in Paris and hadn't returned to Pakistan in years, flew back. A pall fell over the house. Already the bond among the servants weakened. Hassan disappeared to his quarters, his face fallen in. The house was full of mourners, the governor came, ambassadors, retired generals. There was nothing to do, no food would be served. Rafik sought her out. He came to her room, where she sat on the bed, contemplating the emptiness of her future. Even the child had become silent. When Rafik came in she stood up, and he leaned against her and sobbed. She couldn't understand what he said, except that he repeated how he had fastened the old man's shirt the last evening in the hospital, but as he told the story he kept saying butters instead of buttons. He couldn't finish the sentence, he repeated the first words over and over. Finally he became quiet, face streaked. That was the last time ever that she held him. After a week Sawat called all the servants into the living room. She sat wearing a sari, her face pinched and eyes ringed, arms hung with gold bracelets. I'm going to explain what happens to you. Rafik and Hassan have spoken to, as well as the old drivers. The ones who've been in service more than 10 years will get 50,000 rupees. The rest of you will get 2,000 for each year of service. If you need recommendations, I'll supply them. You served my father well, I thank you. This house will be sold, but until it is, you'll receive your salaries and can stay in your quarters. She stood up, on the brink of tears, dignified. Thank you, goodbye. Crushed, they all left. They had expected this, but somehow hoped the house would be kept. It must be worth a tremendous amount, with its gardens and location in the heart of old British Lahore, where the great houses were gradually being demolished, to make way for ugly flats and townhouses. That all was passing, houses where carriages once had been kept, flags lowered at sunset to the lawns of British commissioners. Gone, and they the servants would never find another berth like this one, the gravity of the house, the gentleness of the master, the vast damp rooms, the slow lugubrious pace, the order within disorder. She found Hassan in the kitchen, muted for once. What'll become of me, she asked. After all, something must come of his intimacy with her. She had slept with him, held him. The stark fact of her body shown to him, given to him, must be worth something. She wished for this, and knew that it wasn't so. With Rafik it had been different, he had raised her up, but Hassan had degraded her. She saw her hopes receding. Again she became the stained creature who threw herself at Hassan, for the little things he gave her. You came with nothing, you leave with nothing. You've been paid and fed for some time at least. You have decent clothes and a little slug of money. What of you and Rafik? We're being put in the Islamabad house. And did Rafik say anything to the mistresses about me? Nothing, Hassan said cruelly. Not a word. He put his hands on the counter and looked directly in her face. It's over. There never was any hope. I spent my life in this kitchen. Look at me, I'm old. Rafik's old. So Rafik had renounced her. At the end of the month she had found another place, with some friends of Harouni, who took her because she came from this house. Before leaving she said to Rafik one day, meet me tonight in the kitchen. You owe me that. She found him waiting for her, under a single bulb. He had aged, his face thin, shoulders bent. Worst of all, his eyes were frightened, as if he didn't understand where he was. Harouni had been his life, his morning and night, his charge, his wealth. What of the child, she asked. Will you help him? When he's grown, will you find him a job? I'll be gone long before that, dear girl. Say that once you loved me. Of course I did. I do. I loved you more. Within 2 years she was finished, began using rocket pills, which she once had so much despised, lost her job, went on to heroin, leaving her husband behind without a word. She knew all about that life from her husband and father. The man who controlled the lucrative corner where she ended up begging took most of her earnings. This way she escaped prostitution. She cradled the little boy in her arms, holding him up to the windows of cars. Rafik sent money, a substantial amount, so long as she had an address. And then, soon enough, she died, and the boy begged in the streets, one of the sparrows of Lahore.